So we're very much at the end now. This is my last lecture because on Wednesday, Professor Minkema from the Jonathan Edwards Center is going to come and talk to us about the very problematic figure of Jonathan Edwards. I think that's in some ways quite an interesting place for us to conclude, because it raises all sorts of challenging questions, and I hope in many ways that's what we've been doing all along. I want today to do yet again the impossible, and that is to cover an enormous topic in 45 minutes, the Enlightenment, nothing less. But I want to do it not by a kind of flood of information, although there is quite a lot on the PowerPoint, but rather to think about some central ideas that I hope have kind of animated the course and the questions. You'll see that these sorts of questions reflected in the exam questions, which I'll send out later today, which are done. And one of the questions we started with way back at the beginning is thinking about, is there progress in history? Where do we stand in relationship to the past? Have we emancipated ourselves from the past? Is the past something we have left behind? Are we improved upon the past? Are we, to use the term from today, more enlightened? Or do we have to think about the past with a little bit more humility? I was reading an article over the weekend which was talking about climate change, and that the resistance to climate change, I mean, it's a point that we all know, but it was very well formulated, that the resistance to climate change has been, of course, on the part of those who benefit most from current economic systems. And it was using the language of kind of judgment and punishment in a kind of Christian apocalyptic way, of sort of visions of the last judgment, and saying basically that in this world that the damned have been the poor, those who have suffered most from climate change and have no voice in altering the forms of disaster that is inflicted on them. And it just made me think in terms of today, that we have so little to say we are better than the people in the past, that we somehow are much more sophisticated. Yes, of course, there has been change, and yes, of course, there are many things that are improved, and we can point to them. But I think it's so easy, and this has been certainly guilty of a lot of historical narratives, to simply see ourselves as on a kind of endless, progressive state in which we are always becoming better. And I think the events of the last 2 years, and we can all think of them, are demonstrating that a great deal more humility is required. And also, I hope we've had the opportunity to think about how the past is still very much with us and very much informs the way we think. We cannot cast off the past, even if it seems to have been a long time ago. But also, it is, I think, very helpful for us to remember that in very different times and in very different cultures, there are questions and images and debates, problems that are recognizable to us, that remind us that we have not moved beyond many of those issues. So as we now come to the end, I hope that that this course is not simply a kind of information download, but rather a chance of, as we hoped at the beginning of the class, to think about what it is to think about our history. And to think about how we both connect and are disconnected from cultures that are, in terms of time, very distant from us, but where we find points of contact and where we find, by the fact that to get in touch with those cultures, whether it's you do global history, any kind of history that we do, requires us to step outside ourselves, to step outside our assumptions. And that, I think, requires humility. And it requires an openness to being, a term that Calvin used all the time, to be teachable. And I think if we stop being teachable from the past, this kind of cliche that we're bound to repeat it, I don't think that happens, that our cultures are constantly changing. Repetition is simply not possible. But we are much impoverished by not engaging with that past, by not trying to understand other people on their own terms. Yes, I forgot this. The break has reminded me that this is not working very well. So I want to talk in that spirit about the Enlightenment, because probably no period has been held up in the West as a kind of notion of the supremacy of the West. The fact that we are an enlightened culture. I remember when I was an undergraduate, we were talking about Russian novels in the 19th century, and the professor said, well, of course, Russia never had an Enlightenment. So there was this sense that they had not progressed in the way that we had. They hadn't embraced rationality. And rationality was the great sort of buzzword of the Enlightenment. Reason. Not superstition. And of course, for many people, that meant not religion. One of the great myths, we're going to talk about this in a moment, is somehow the Enlightenment emancipated us from religion. That religion was the irrational. Enlightenment was the rational. And of course, the figure that was always appealed to is the German Immanuel Kant. Reason. So there's this sense that we had progressed, and of course there is the American Revolution, and perhaps above all in this context, the French Revolution. Deeply secular, at least that's how the story was always told. Yet, we know, of course, that the French revolutionaries literally erected a monument to a goddess of reason. So I want to talk about a period that indeed is of remarkable change and brings in things that are recognizable to us. But at the same time, I want to suggest is not some sort of improvement on everything else we've done in this class. That somehow, in this course, all roads led to the Enlightenment. And that now serves as the springboard for those of you who go on to do modern history. That now, finally, we've left behind those medieval and early modern people and have now found ourselves, the people that we are, progressive, enlightened, rational. So these are the myths. I've spoken about them before. Of a generation that when I was an undergraduate, the Enlightenment was secular. It was anti-religious. It was when we start to get the modern secular world, thank goodness, and get away from this irrationality of religion that had only caused wars and destruction, divided people, and encouraged irrational superstition. This is the age when you start to have this narrative that we talked about before of science being the liberating force. Separation of church and state. the secular state, all these things attributed to the virtues of the Enlightenment, individualism. Now, none of this is absolutely untrue. As we've talked about many times, history never works like that. Of course, aspects of it are true. But it's, again, like we talked about at the beginning, what do you make your narratives of? Do you construct your narratives around the things that you find most amenable? Which is the way, in many ways, in which I was taught the Enlightenment by what I would assume for the most part were very secular historians who had little time for religion. So that's the story they wanted to tell. There was a very famous professor here at Yale named Peter Gay, who was a historian of the Enlightenment, wrote many books. But for him, the Enlightenment was secularism. But I want to I hope we'll get through this, but to talk about some of these terms that rather complicate this story. First of all, the notion of reasonable religion. A religion that goes some way towards the language of reason, and in some ways marks a very distinctive change. What does that reasonable religion look like? Notions of moderation. We had a touch of it in Locke. What does moderation? These are terms that these people used themselves. Reason and revelation. Who is the figure of Jesus Christ? Was he an ethical figure? Or was he in fact the Son of God? This is a period where people are debating that very seriously. We see the beginning of modern discussions. Civilizing. This is an age of colonialism, building on the colonialism of the 16th and 17th century. But in the 18th century is, of course, the age of great mercantile empires, built, of course, on slavery, built on exploitation. But this is the age in which the great cities of Europe, and as my wife finds very difficult, the city of Glasgow, from which she comes from in Scotland, all these 18th century buildings built on what? This is the age of mercantile empires, global mercantile empires, vast wealth which fuels change. It's the age when missions begin to start. Missions of the late 18th and 19th century is fueled by this idea of civilizing, Christianity as civilizing. And civilizing along certain ideals of the Enlightenment. A rational religion that transforms the peoples into something that for us in the West is seen as civilization. But you will see this. The Bible, something I'm working on in a different context. The Bible is the instrument of civilization. It's used to teach English. It's used to educate people, to read and to write, because it's seen as this book that civilizes. And sentiment, perhaps a word we're not so familiar with if you're a reader of the novels of Jane Austen. The word sense and sensibility, sentiment. Very strong notion, which reminds us that the Enlightenment isn't about some sort of hardcore rejection of the emotions, but it in fact is an age in which the sentiment, the feelings, the emotions are actually embraced. This is the age that will also yield romantic poetry. Wordsworth, or in German context, idealists who in Goethe, and the culture of nature and God, almost a kind of pantheism of God in nature. So there's a lot of different things happening here at the same time. Now, in some ways, of course, this is a reaction against what's been happening in the early modern world, just as we found in Locke. Certainly, the Reformation led to a series of highly destructive religious wars. Now, those terms are debatable, and we'll just have to use a sort of shorthand here. But the 30 Years' War, an extraordinarily, even compared to World War II, the most destructive war in terms of civilian losses, destroyed the center of Europe. And it was, in many ways, a war about religion. And there certainly was a reaction in the late 17th and 18th centuries to this idea that war had been brought about by religious difference. And that the confessions, whether Reformed, Lutheran, in Britain, the Church of England, all of these different manifestations of Protestantism, together with, in the Catholic Church, that these hardening of theological positions was just leading to endless and fruitless conflict, which, in the worldly eyes of many people, was bad for business. So there was a sense that there was a problem of religion that needed to be solved. And that, it very much inspires new forms of thinking, of which Locke is one, with his limited notion of toleration. Toleration, as we talked about before, is not this idea of kind of modern liberalism, even though that can certainly be debated, what kinds of toleration we have. But that's not our immediate concern. But toleration, you saw for Locke, was very limited. It didn't include Jews, it didn't include Catholics. And it could only be along certain lines. But there's the beginning of this conversation. I just have a quotation from Locke, which in some ways illustrates this concern. He talks about here the diversity of opinions, which cannot be avoided, but the refusal of toleration, again within his context of it, which leads to the bustles and wars that have been in the Christian world on account of religion. So there is a belief that there is a problem of religion. And one of the places this plays out, remember Locke goes to the Dutch Republic, that the Dutch Republic becomes a kind of seedbed of new religious thinking. And one of the reasons is that it's so incredibly diverse. It's made up not only of Catholics and Protestants, but has an extraordinarily large Jewish population. Many of the Jews who were expelled from Spain went to the Low Countries. Amsterdam became a center of Jewish culture and a center of Jewish printing, but also major Jewish thinkers such as Baruch Spinoza, we know little time, but one of the major Jewish thinkers of this period who's very much on the edge of a very revolutionary thinker who's raising questions about the nature of religion between private and public religion, about the authority of the Bible, about the claims of dogmatic religion. So in some ways he's an individual figure, but he's part of a growing debate about these aspects of religion, the role of rigid dogma. Remember, the Reformation had really, both Catholic and Protestant, had cast their positions around very clear-cut doctrinal positions, because that's what conflict does. It always leads you to a certain retrenchment, a certain insistence on what it is that absolutely defines you. What we're seeing in Spinoza and Locke and Hugo Grotius, we'll talk about in a moment, are major thinkers who are considering how we can find common ground between religions rather than focusing on that which divides, that which defines against one another. Dutch Republic, you just can see here up is what is modern day Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, France in the south. You can see that it's, see if my light, yeah, so you can see just on the coast with England, France, Germany. So in a center of commerce, very wealthy. Here you just see something about Spinoza, an absolutely fascinating figure who's at the forefront, although he himself is condemned, is at the forefront of a lot of thinking about the nature of religion. But there is a widespread community of people who are thinking about this. And one of the ideas, the language that starts to emerge, is that of reasonable religion. Now that may have a certain ring to our ears. What's reasonable religion? Here it has a slightly more particular sense. And that is, what is the meeting point of religion as revelation and human reason? Remember, this notion, for those of you who are interested in philosophy, know much more about this than I do probably, that figures of Descartes, who talked about I think, therefore I am, the notion of the human consciousness, of reason being that which you can know, where there could be certainty. The whole 17th century is an age in which there is this search for certainty. If you think about the Puritans, endlessly concerned about their salvation, trying to find marks of election. John Bunyan, who describes his scruples about trying to find expressions, signs of divine grace. The uncertainty of war and tumult in the 17th century launches this idea of a search for certainty. And so in some ways what we're following on here is a hope to try to find that certainty in a more expansive view of religion. Now we have to remember that we're talking about a few elite people who are leading this debate. This is not a debate that's really happening in the wider churches or synagogues. Yes, some of these ideas are being disseminated, but only in really embryonic ways. This is a debate that's going forward largely amongst a relatively small and contained group of people to which Locke belongs. But even if we think about Calvin's Geneva, casting our minds back to what kind of city that was when he arrived in 1541, by the 18th century, that Calvinist city, which still defined itself in terms of being Calvinist, is seeing some remarkable changes. Some really significant figures, I'll mention a couple in a moment, have advocated this idea that there is a way of reconciling Calvinist or Reformed theology and reason. That reason is not simply belong to fallen humanity, but it is a divine gift. And that reason points towards truth. So that there's, in a sense, of course, a much more optimistic view of human capacity than we would have found in Calvin or traditional Reformed or going back to Augustinian thought. And so that ideas, that Enlightenment language, such as happiness, which is not just our sense of being kind of lightly joyful, but this happiness as a sense of contentment, of joy within life, of the goodness of life, which is an Enlightenment term that starts to be associated with reason, that reason can point us towards happiness, begins to be embraced in the language of religion. But also what's happening here is the beginning of considerable doubt about traditional teachings of the church. The principles of reason applied to the Bible lead people to question, is God Trinity? Can we know that? Do we know that Christ was divine? In the Reformed tradition, a questioning of the doctrine of predestination. So that this coming together of reason and religion and this reasonable Christianity leads to a degree of skepticism about about many of the traditional teachings of the church, sort of creedal Christianity. Now, this is, again, not to say that they're suddenly abandoning all this, but this is an age when that language is starting to be used. And one of the most influential forces behind this is a growth in what we might call the science of history, historical research, historical thinking. This is the beginning point of what in the 19th century becomes historical criticism of the Bible, when leading figures start to talk increasingly of the Bible as a historical document and start to undo what they see as the myth, like the Exodus, or whether Moses wrote the first 5 books. But this is a beginning point in the 17th century of a kind of historical reading of Scripture and a historical assessment of Christianity. And this leads many prominent figures towards a sense of skepticism about central teachings of the church. So this is, of course, will flourish in the 19th century, which is beyond our, but I've just listed, you don't need to worry about these names, I've just given them more in terms of examples with Turretini, Jacob Vernet. Reason is even more necessary in theology than it is in human jurisprudence. This embrace of reason, that reason and revelation do not contradict one another. It's also this idea that Turretini argues for, that religion should focus on what we can know. If we go back and think about the scientific revolution that we talked about, we think about Galileo, we think about these debates, or we think about Descartes, the philosopher. This age of seeking certainty is also really asking the question, what can we know? And that's at the heart of this period that we can broadly call the Enlightenment. And one of the ways of thinking that is emerging is an emphasis on reading the Bible in terms of its, and Locke talks about this reading the Bible of what it says here, the moral and practical aspects, Jesus as a kind of moral exemplar, skepticism about the traditional language of divinity, of the human and divine natures of Christ, skepticism to even a certain extent in more extreme circles about questions of the resurrection. That's much less so, but skepticism about traditional teachings about original sin, arising in part from thinking that has a more positive attitude towards human nature. I'm not going to go through this, but one ways we see this, and thinking also still about Calvin's Geneva, the Geneva of the 18th century, is that a student of mine did her doctoral dissertation on preaching in Geneva in this period. And there she found that there was a distinct shift in the message towards the ethical and practical, away from traditional doctrines. Emphasis on the ethical centrality of Christ, the exemplary nature of Christ, but also the ways in which a more optimistic language of reason is being brought into the preaching of the church. So there is certainly a significant change happening. But there's also resistance. And no movement goes ahead without considerable resistance. And in this case, we're also thinking about a movement that is still very much amongst a minority of people. The vast majority of people in this period of the Enlightenment remain traditional believers in the churches. This Enlightenment on which we have focused so much in the past is, of course, an elite movement amongst a few. Those ideas over the 19th and 20th century will gain purchase in the wider community, but we're talking about it now in a kind of test tube where these ideas are running very much ahead of where most people are. But there's concern, but there is resistance to this. I'll just move on to, they talked about Vernet as a representative of this notion of moderation. This seeking of a way of a balance, a kind of golden mean between reason and traditional Christianity that emphasizes not what divides people, but what is common ground, belief in God, the singular role of Jesus Christ, the teaching of the ethical life, emphasis on such points and away from doctrinal points that are much more divisive. It's an attitude that seeks more directly to embrace changes in the scientific world. It's an attitude that seeks more positively to embrace changes in commercial and economic developments. But as Professor Minkema will talk about on Wednesday, it also spurs opposition. Pietism in German lands, a kind of spiritual form of Lutheranism, which becomes deeply influential in England in the formation of the Wesley Brothers and Methodism, an emphasis on conversion, renewal, life in the Spirit, personal relationship with God. So we have both, and a deep alarm that the Bible is being reduced from a sacred book to a more historical book. So we see this movement going forward in certain circles, but at the same time, we see a kind of counterforce. And that's what will lead in America to the Great Awakening, the spiritual movements of the late 18th and into the 19th century. So we always have to remember when we're thinking about this that there are different directions happening at the same time, sometimes contradictory and sometimes deeply influenced by one another. I talked about this point, that a large part of what's driving the sort of ideas of religious change is an emphasis on history, seeing the Christian faith in light of its historical development, which then raises questions that doctrines of the church emerged later, that the church has always been, particularly in its early years, in one of doctrinal formulation, and that those doctrinal formulations were often contingent on political and historical events. This attitude, which will grow very much in the 19th century, is the seeing Christianity much more as a historical religion, rather than a received body of ideas, of beliefs, of doctrinal points. And as I say, that same attitude is increasingly being applied to Scripture, seeing it more and more as a historical document. In the short time remaining, I want to just give a few more things. That, again, one of the narratives of the Enlightenment is that it comes out of Protestantism. And I really want to leave the impression this morning that it does, in certain ways, have significant Protestant thinkers in its early years, but it is across religions. We now think more centrally about a Jewish Enlightenment, the revival of the Hebrew language, the revival of Hebrew studies, an engagement of discussion between the relationship between religion and faith, ways of finding paths of moderation. And as we will see in a moment in the figure of Moses Mendelssohn, a sense of trying to balance integration into Christian Europe with trying to retain a distinct Jewish identity. Moses Mendelssohn, I think, is one of the most fascinating characters of this period, deeply imbued with the Enlightenment ideas of reason, but deeply committed to his Jewish inheritance. Powerful writer whose influence extends far beyond the Jewish communities to Christians and even to Islam. An advocate of freedom of thought, toleration, and moderation in religion. An emphasis that we see amongst other Enlightenment figures of education as the instrument of renewal. Remember, that had been so central to the Reformation? Well, once again, education is seen as the way in which society will be transformed. Extraordinarily high view of education. This is a time when many institutes of higher learning are established not only in Europe but around the world. Think of the number of 18th century institutions of learning that are established in this country. It is a time of enormous engagement with education as a way of transforming society. I also want to very briefly make the point that it is not simply a Protestant story, but that the Enlightenment has powerful effects on many Catholic thinkers, many of whom who look to reason as being reconcilable with the traditional doctrines of the Catholic Church. They're not so much looking for reconciliation with Protestantism, but they see within the Catholic tradition many ideals that are reconcilable with Enlightenment principles of moderation, but also this idea that education should be at the forefront and less of an emphasis on dogma. Now that in some ways will change in the 19th century in response to the growth of secularization and the Industrial Revolution and Darwinism and other things. But we find here, and perhaps one of the most remarkable figure amongst this, are French Catholics who deeply influenced by the revolutionary movements in their own country. But you can see here the clerical assembly which says, our God is a God who teaches useful things. This is a crucial term, shared across the spectrum. Religion is useful. Now, again, that can sound very banal in our language, but useful means that religion is transformative. It leads to a better society, to a better individual, to a moral world, an ethical world. So religion isn't simply otherworldly, but is transforming in this world. That's what makes it useful. And the search is to find that which is useful in religion. One of the interesting figures here, again, you don't need to take this in, but just as a matter of illustration, is this figure of Abbé Gérard, and who is an extensive writer, who is significant on a variety of fronts, but for our conversation, notable for the way in which he emphasizes Catholicism as a reasonable religion. I've talked about this before, and there's a kind of need to get on, but I just want to underscore this idea that this education, this idea of moderation, of toleration, these are all wrapped up in a notion of civilizing. Civilizing is, and you can see this here in the letter of Gérard, bind all nations together by a more human, more moral, and more extensive law of nations. This belief in an underlying rational natural order that is reasonable. And if you can uncover that, that will provide an optimistic basis for peace between countries and of this notion of civilization. But once more, there are opponents. I've spoken about already that there are those the sort of spiritualists Pietists, Methodists, and those sort of what we would broadly call evangelicals, who are deeply worried that the Christian faith is being taken down, dismantled, and turned into nothing more than ethics. But there is an attack on the other side, and of course this is important for the American context, and that is deism, which completely rejects the kind of the religion of revelation of Christianity, rejects the person of Christ, that holds to what we might loosely call a kind of agnosticism, a God who is still, in a sense, transcendent and active in the world, but not a Trinitarian God, in many ways not a Christian God. I really want to get to this point, that the Enlightenment, with all its talk of reason, is not to be confused with simply a cold rationality. Reason, for these people, is a beautiful thing. It's an aesthetic. It's nothing less than God's eternal order in the world. It's not just clever, intellective manipulation. So to get a sense of reason, we need to see that it is also in Enlightenment talk closely connected with the notion of sentiment and sentimentality. Once again, a difficult idea for us to engage with, because sentimentality tends to be seen as naive or even more pejorative. A kind of longing for something that may never have existed or may never come back again. A kind of seeing it through rose-colored spectacles, seeing something as something very different than what it had really been. We have all these different notions of sentiment and sentimentality. Sentiment and sentimentality is part of the Enlightenment discourse, but it means something very different. It means our emotions. It means our imagination. It means that which sort of activates us in terms of passions. It is our aesthetic, our sense of beauty, but it is also compassion towards others. In many ways, it is what makes us human, but they do not see this as simply dividing reason and sentiment. This is the 17th, but more into the 18th and the 19th century, is an age of sentiment, a word that's very central to writers, literary, philosophical, theological. And back to Vernet, who I mentioned before, who says that humans should live not by reason, but by instinct and sentiment, appeal to the beautiful. This is on the verge of the age of Romanticism, which finds the beautiful in creation. In fact, to a certain extent, finds God in creation. The inner sentiments, along with reason, is what makes us human. And in sermons and religion, this reasonable religion appeals to that within us and transforms us. So the Reformed person is not simply some sort of what we might think of as a kind of Kantian intellectual, but a person in their entirety. This, I think, gives us a very different sense of what we often characterize Enlightenment as being. This kind of cold. This idea of that sentiment is a God or divinely endowed gift. It is at the heart of this. Now, that's a language that traditional Christianity has not really used. Of course, it talks about the emotions and the passions, and often in very negative ways. But here we see, as part of this more positive notion of humanity, this lifting up of the sentiments. And I just, some example of language that's used. Warmth, light. Remember the Wesleys talking about a warmness in their conversion. the evangelical movements of the Great Awakening, this sense of heat, of passion, of warmth, of light, of sentiment, very much at the root of major forms of American Christianity, but across the Western world, and very much this evangelical fervor that inspires many of the missionary movements of the 18th and 19th century. Jesus is the supreme example of that sentiment. Jesus is compassion. Term that I've noted here, of generous emotions. Jesus is not simply the figure who dies in a bloody sacrifice on the cross. We talked about this way back in the late Middle Ages, the sort of emphasis on the suffering Christ, the bodily afflictions, the atonement as a kind of punitive act, and Christ suffering for us. Of course, that doesn't entirely go away. But here we see a stronger disposition towards a kind of sweetness of Christ. And think of those 18th and 19th century hymns if you come from that tradition. The role of sentiment, of the personal relationship with Christ. It's an age of the sentimental novel. I don't need to go in this, just to make this point. Jane Austen, perhaps one of the most recognizable. It is an age in which we see all of these ideas lead to significant legal acts, legislative acts of toleration. I'm not going to go through this, but for blasphemy, Jews, eventually across Europe, between Catholics and Protestants, this does not mean that everybody suddenly becomes nice towards each other. But there is a recognition driven from this that toleration becomes a thing. Of course, part of this is the beginning of the abolitionist movement, which comes very much out of this culture. I've mentioned hymns here, just here to wrap up here, but perhaps one of the most familiar figures in this is Isaac Watts, whose hymns are still sung in many churches. I think a wonderful example, whatever you think of his hymns, of this kind of deeply personal piety. As I say here, the emphasis on the individual conscience, this notion of a much more individual form of Christianity that speaks to that kind of spirit of conversion and renewal, which becomes so powerful in the 18th and 19th century, about which Professor Minkema will talk on Wednesday. But he's also arguing for sort of freedom of the church from the state. The last point, we're wrapping up here, so is what we see here is the emergence of what we would recognize as the modern idea of religion as private and personal, as in relationship to a public form of religion. That's a distinction that now is starting to emerge, and that religion as a deeply personal, individual thing in relationship to the more public sphere of religion. This is in the embryonic form, but I just mentioned here Benjamin Franklin as one of this, and notions of public religion. Again, at the founding of America, we see aspects of this. I am the last person to talk to you about American history, so, but I do want to sense that it is very much part of your tradition, these ideas, these Enlightenment ideas of religion.